Hello and welcome to this video on how to compare poetry. I'm going to compare today Charge of the Light Brigade and War Photographer and show you a foolproof method, BOOTSE, which will always get you the top grades. So here's a quick overview of what BOOTSE is. It's not just what to include in your essay, it's also the order in which you'll do it. So first off, many students think that they need to write an introduction, but actually that's a waste of time. What you need to do is just quote from the beginning of the poem and then remember to link that to the poet's viewpoint. What's the poet's viewpoint at the beginning? What can you infer about the poet's purpose? Why have they written this poem? Next, you're going to look at SOAP aims. I've rearranged SOAP aims here. Hopefully you know what they are. I'll actually teach you more techniques than that, but it's just a reminder that you have to write about the poetic techniques. That's really what that's there for. If you have time, then there's another one to add in. That depends on your standard as a student. You might not have time for that. Then look at the title, always referring back to the poet's viewpoint. That might not always be appropriate, but it's a good habit to get into because this is the same technique I use for teaching the unseen poem. Next, we move on to structure and form, and I'll show you how to do that. And then finally, the ending of the poem. This is where students often write a conclusion which just repeats stuff that they've put earlier. But actually, if you analyze the ending, that will give you a final poet's viewpoint, and therefore that itself will be the conclusion. Okay, here are the beginnings of both poems for you, and I'm just going to zoom in on particular language. To begin with, I'm going to notice right at the beginning that Tennyson begins with anaphora, that repetition at the beginning of the line, and now I have to link that to the poet's purpose. Well, this is to emphasize the distance that the soldiers have to ride before they can actually engage the enemy, and during that whole distance they're vulnerable to being killed themselves. So this repetition, the anaphora, highlights the soldiers' extreme bravery. Right, now my exam tactic is to find something that I can compare that to. So I go across to the beginning of War Photographer and I think, well, is there any anaphora? No, there isn't. Is there any repetition? Yes, there is. I'm going to this line here. And I'm also saying, is there anything that looks at heroism? And I'm going to argue that this is the opposite of heroism at the beginning. So I've got a comparison to make. In contrast, Duffy uses the repetition of alliteration here. Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass. This is also a repetition of the rhythm of a mass, so it's a religious symbolism. Repetition of this metaphor here, which signifies that all human flesh is like grass, easily cut down and killed. So this is about slaughter, just as the Charge of the Light Brigade will be. Another allusion is to Radio 4, where this kind of rhythm comes from the shipping forecast, actually. And a similar idea comes in the writing of Charge of the Light Brigade, where Tennyson takes his story not from real life, as it were, he wasn't an eyewitness, but from the newspaper. Hopefully you remember the next step. We've done the beginning, now we look at an aspect of language, and we mustn't forget to name the technique and link it to the poet's viewpoint and purpose. So I begin a new paragraph looking at Tennyson's purpose here, and I'm going to pick on this metaphor, into the valley of death, which I'm going to suggest is a cliche. And he uses a cliche because he's saying something that's always true. British soldiers face up to death frequently because they are all heroes. And so the Light Brigade becomes a symbol for all British soldiers, all British cavalry, all the fighting men of England. They are all heroes. And that's why a cliche is appropriate. It's something we all understand. And that, again, is emphasized by the alliteration of do and die. And this contrast here, or juxtaposition, encapsulates the English mentality. They do their duty even though it results in almost inevitable death. And this is something to be celebrated rather than to be horrified by. Right, I now compare this to War Photographer, where Carol Ann Duffy also uses metaphor. So we have the spools of suffering. So this metaphor involves the spools, which describe the old-fashioned film that's in the camera, but also suggests that the suffering that's in the photographs is still real, and he's watching the suffering spool out in front of him. Now, we've got alliteration there again, so we've got a similar technique. Hopefully you remember that the alliteration with the S is called sibilance, and that here is almost hiss-like, as though it's an accusation against the photographer. And if we pop up to the line above, we can then see that the dark room has a symbolic meaning here. What he does in it is dark, not just literally, but in terms of the deeds that have happened there. He's filmed death, perhaps for our own entertainment, and perhaps he's not bringing a sense of guilt to this, which is conveyed here with the ordered rows. So Duffy could be introducing us to the idea that the photographer has become insensitized, or desensitized, I should say, to the horror of what he's photographing. Okay, now tactically, I don't have to write about metaphor and alliteration from the same part of the poem. In this section of the video, I'm going to show you that these techniques are everywhere, and you just need to discover for yourself how many paragraphs, how many comparisons you can write. So I'll put in, at this stage, more than you would do in your actual exam essay. Okay, now I'm going to focus on, again, this repeated anaphora, cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them. And it's used by the poet to emphasize, again, the great heroism of the soldiers, despite the fact that they are completely surrounded by cannon fire. And that repetition emphasizes how little escape the soldiers have, how vulnerable they are. The other thing it does is it gives us a rhythm, and we've got this trochaic meter where the first syllable is emphasized. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them. That emphasis on the first syllable shows us how imminent the danger is. I can make a further point if I wish, to show that the rhythm of the line tries to recreate the steady rhythm of the horses. You know, they're charging, but it's a controlled charge, and we feel that in the rhythm of the poem. There's no sense of panic, even though they're riding into the jaws of death, and they're very likely to die. Now let's focus on War Photographer, where the photographer is imagining this moment when he's watched a man get shot in front of his wife, and all he's done is taken a photograph of it. He hasn't intervened. Without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. We can talk about the fact that this is a couplet, and the couplet is there to emphasize the great moral dilemma that he has, doing what he must do, even though he's facing this man's death, this man's dust. And the use of the word dust here suggests how pointless perhaps that sacrifice was, and perhaps how pointless the photograph is. It doesn't actually change anything. Now I can also look at the emphasis of where syllables are emphasized, and here we've got an iambic line, so without words to do what someone must, whereas oh sorry, that was gibberish. It's actually trochaic meter, so without words to do what someone must, whereas the next line becomes iambic, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. So I can make the point that there's no coherence in the syllable pattern here. The poet is flitting from trochaic meter to iambic to reflect the disquiet that the photographer feels, and also perhaps that the poet feels about the photographer's action, this moral dilemma that he's facing. So I hope you've noticed that I've confined myself to 2 examples, although actually what you find is that there's more than one technique in each quotation that you look at. And I've tried to link them each time to the poet's viewpoint and purpose. That's what's going to nail me the marks. Now, my next step, if I need it, is to go to the title. I've included lots of meanings here so that you can see they aren't hard to find once you practice this. Obviously, when I'm writing, I might only pick 1 or 2 of these. I don't need them all. So there isn't an emphasis on the tragedy or the death. There's an emphasis on the actual charge, the heroism of the cavalry. There's a symbolic association of light, as in Light Brigade. Yes, that's what they're actually called, but Tennyson is using that symbolically to suggest goodness or godliness. The definite article suggests that we should know about it already. There's this idea that this is a famous charge, and it should be famous throughout history. We should all find out about it. We should all celebrate it. And then finally, charge is a homophone here, suggestive of great cost, the cost of the soldiers' lives, which nevertheless Tennyson is saying is worth paying. In War Photographer, we have this juxtaposition, which is almost oxymoronic, of war, something that's deeply distressing, with photographer, something that we associate with pleasure. So that juxtaposition of horror and pleasure is at the heart of this poem. When we get to the end and we look at the Sunday supplement, which people read for pleasure, and they find this horrific war and then ignore it. There is no the here, so the war stands for all war and the photographer for all war photographers. In other words, the poem works as an argument. She's not really interested in a specific photographer. And then you might want to comment about how the poem is structured around a series of pictures which invite our response. She simply gives us snapshots, very much like a photographer would. So we're on the home stretch here in the exam. I next need to write about the structure and form of the poem. So I've already made some structural points about the anaphora here and the use of cliche here. Now I'm going to look at the use of contrast. So we have shattered and sundered, then they rode back, but not the 600. So I can talk about the enjambment here, which is going to emphasize the fact that hardly any of these soldiers returned, or cavalrymen, I should say, and the repetition emphasizes that again. And this deliberate contrast between the 600 who set out and the few who have returned emphasizes the nobility of their sacrifice. Now, if I come across to War Photographer, in red I've highlighted all the contrasts I could find. You can see that they're all over the place. I'm going to zoom in on this one at the bottom, where he talks about the tears that the reader might feel, but these are immediately replaced by the pre-lunch beers. So this juxtaposition shows how little the readers care, and by definition, how little we care about the effects of war. Now, I'm not going to write a conclusion. I'm simply going to write about the ending and link that to the poet's purpose, and that forms my conclusion. So Tennyson emphasizes the nobility of what these men have done, they that had fought so well, and we celebrate them doing their duty and sacrificing their life, and that's reinforced by this final ending, all that was left of them, left of the 600. And the repetition again of left suggests how many have died. You can bring in some historical context here, because actually over 400 returned, which is not the impression created by the poet, where we might imagine that probably only 50 made it back. And he does that through this repetition of the jaws of death and the mouth of hell. In contrast, War Photographer ends ambiguously. So where Tennyson is writing in order to celebrate British soldiers and celebrate the continuance of war, here we've got this use of the word impassively, which suggests that the photographer doesn't feel anything for what he's looking down on, our country, his own country, as he looks down from the aeroplane. But it also suggests perhaps that he should be feeling emotion, and he's denied himself that in order to perform his job. It ends with this final contrast, the juxtaposition, where they, and by association we, do not care about the photos that we see. But at the same time, this is his living, and this is where the ambiguity comes in. Duffy is asking, should this photographer be allowed to make his living revealing other people's suffering, especially when those photographs of suffering do not seem to make a difference, and where war and suffering are inevitable consequences of the support for war we have in our society. And so my final contextual piece is to say that Duffy has written her poem probably in response to the kind of jingoistic, nationalistic, patriotic poetry that Tennyson's poem is an example of. So her poem is an argument against his. So I hope I've shown you that studying the poems in pairs is much more useful, that you don't need to know each poem in incredible detail. And now let's finally look at my explanation of what the examiner is looking for. This comes straight from the mark scheme, and actually there are 10 crucial points. I find this more useful than just saying there are 3 assessment objectives. Have we been critical? In other words, analysed and judged things? Yes, I think we have. We've definitely explored different interpretations. I've made it well structured because we've always gone from one poem to the other, and we've proceeded in the BOOTSE structure that forces you to get that way. Is it conceptualized? Yes, because we've always come back to the poet's purpose. Do we have a range of references, embedded quotations? Well, I hope you've seen that I've been picking on individual words all the way through. Is it an insightful analysis of language? Yes, it is, because I've always named each technique. And hopefully you've realized that every time you quote, there is always a technique that you can mention. We've covered structure in several parts. Here I haven't mentioned form because there's nothing really relevant to say about it. Yes, the Charge of the Light Brigade is an elegiac or elegiac kind of poem, but it doesn't really have a form that we could name, and the same with the War Photographer. Subject terminology has been used throughout, and that makes it judicious. And finally, we've dealt with many more than one idea, lots of different perspectives, lots of context embedded as we go. Yeah, there haven't been any separate contextual paragraphs. So I wanted to get this video done in under 20 minutes. I'm really chuffed with myself. That's going to be my new resolution, to try and make the videos shorter so your revision can be quicker. Good luck with your revision, and don't forget to subscribe if you want more.